Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with, well, you asked for it, the 12 creakiest major composers in handling form. Yes, form. For all of you form whores, like I'm one of them for sure. Traditional form or otherwise. Lots of composers have issues with form. They're rather hard to pin down sometimes because one person's dysfunctional form is another person's original masterpiece. You've got to be a little careful here. But there are certain clues that tell us when a composer is having a problem with form. Let me give you a suggestion of what a few of them are. First, cuts. If the piece gets cut by other people, then that indicates a certain perception that the composer is having an issue with form, because cuts are never a good thing. Usually every part of the work ought to be necessary, but if you can jettison chunks of it and not miss anything, well, that's a good clue that there's something going on with the form. Now, sometimes historically, nowadays we're in one of these sort of Werktreu periods, as they say in German. Werktreu meaning faithfulness to the work. So we don't make cuts usually. That doesn't mean sometimes they wouldn't be helpful. So that's one issue. Another issue is when other people rewrite the thing. For whatever reason, it gets performed in an edition which is not what the composer originally wrote. That's a good indication that there may be some formal issues going on. And of course, the most important formal issue is if the thing is just boring. I mean, the purpose of form is to keep the music interesting and to make sure that it operates on the appropriate time scale. But if you're nodding off and sleeping in the middle of it, well, that's sort of an indication that there's a formal issue. And some of those, dead spots, you just call them that, dead spots, are an indication that there's something not quite right formally. Now, despite the fact that form is often an issue with some composers, it doesn't always matter. It doesn't matter if the composer writes glorious melodies. I mean, we don't care if they are amazing, glittering orchestrators, if they have, fascinating approaches to things like rhythm and harmony, then we give them a pass. Why? Because they're so strong in other elements. It's not always the most important thing out there in a composer's style, and we have to keep that in mind. So let's go through the list and see what we can find out about creaky composers who quailed at the demands of traditional or other forms. All right, Tchaikovsky, poor old Tchaikovsky. Now, Tchaikovsky could be a master of form. His Pathetique Symphony is amazing. The Fifth Symphony is great until you get to the finale. He always had issues with large-scale form. Part of the problem is because of his melodic gift. Some things are kind of incompatible. Generally speaking, the traditional forms of classical music, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, were created for forms that employed material that was usually brief and punchy and motivic, and it moved very quickly. So you didn't want to dawdle over anything, whereas Tchaikovsky writes these gorgeous, long-breathed melodies, and not all of them are capable of development. This is a problem with romantic music generally, that the romantic cantilena, this big, gushing, wonderful sound, doesn't lend itself so well to development, to being squished into the small spaces that the classical forms were intended to encompass. And so, Tchaikovsky had some issues. You think about, the cuts in the violin concerto, the total rewriting of the second piano concerto, some of his own revisions to his symphonies, the first and the second particularly, the fact that no one's ever quite cared about the Polish, the Third Symphony. There are issues with Tchaikovsky formally, but we don't care. We don't care because he's wonderful. So there you go. After Tchaikovsky, here's a composer who really had issues with form. Spohr. Now, Spohr sort of exists on the fringes of the repertoire. He was, excuse me, I'm like winter allergies, Spohr is a composer who was enormously popular in his day, really considered to be the acme of modern music in the 1830s and 40s and there. And he was a very nice guy who really cared about, the position of musicians in society. He had nothing but the most idealistic views of music and composition. What he didn't have was talent, unfortunately. He was a tremendous violinist. He wrote a treatise on violin playing, but his handling of form was, well, what can we say? Formulaic? Maybe that's the word. Now, actually, Spohr had a bigger problem than that. He performed Beethoven, but thought his music was vulgar and noisy and trashy. His model was Mozart, which is always a good model to have if you're as good as Mozart, which few people are. Spohr had a harmonic problem. His problem, in short, was this. He could write lovely, lovely themes. His harmony was largely chromatic. It was actually quite forward-looking in some respects. I mean, foretelling the Wagner of Tristan and Isolde. I mean, it was, luscious chromatic harmony as often as not. But traditional forms, the classical forms in which Spohr worked, Mozart's forms, were designed to be very, very clear in their goal-directed use of harmony and modulation. And so when Spohr wrote these sort of big, blowsy symphonies that lasted, half an hour, so they weren't terribly long. The problem is they don't go anywhere. And because of his constantly rich, kind of slimy, chromatic, sludgy harmony, they are weak at the knees. That is, the joints, they don't have strong, profiled sections as often as not. Sometimes he did. He was better as a chamber music composer than as an orchestral music composer, actually. But it was a general problem in his mature music that it tends to be busy and notey, and not particularly compelling in terms of its narrative energy. And that's a formal weakness. So, yeah, that was an issue. After Spohr, oh God, Liszt. Liszt. I love Liszt. Liszt was an amazing composer. I mean, a brilliant mind, a visionary in so many ways. He attempted in his symphonic poems to create single movement works based on the transformation of just, an opening basic idea or motive. And sometimes he was successful and sometimes he wasn't. But what Liszt did not have was a sense of timing. And that comes back to haunt many, 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 many composers. We'll talk about another in a second. Liszt didn't know how or when to stop as often as not. And one of the hallmarks of defective formal gambits is senseless repetition. And Liszt was really big on senseless repetition. There are some pieces that do nothing but just repeat themselves for reasons that we have no clue. Festklange, for example, Festklang, that thing. I mean, it begins with a wonderful fanfare. Oh my, it's lovely. It's less lovely the 400th time you hear it. And that is the issue with a lot of Liszt. I mean, his symphonies, the Dante and the Faust, the Faust symphony has, is more successful of the two. It has the central Gretchen movement, which is endless, and then that finale with the chorus that pops up for no reason. He wrote an ending without the chorus, but it's so unsatisfactory. And if you do it with the chorus, well, it's better, but sort of grafted on there without much, motivation. And then there's the Dante Symphony with its two complete endings and a Magnificat thing. And he was never quite sure how to conclude everything. Everything he wrote was an improvisation in one way or another. And so he never played anything the same way twice. And so he never really had to sit down and say, what is going to really work here? What is my conception of this piece? And part of it was his strength and his weakness. Really, it was both. Because the improvisational nature of Liszt music is one of the most wonderful qualities about it. But the problem is that it makes it very hard to determine what the final shape of anything is supposed to be. So, that's a conundrum that he wrestled with his entire life. Another composer who had real formal issues was Richard Strauss. Richard Strauss, it's very, very interesting. When you're dealing with early Strauss, where he wrote his two incredibly boring and uninteresting symphonies, he's just pouring, new wine into old bottles. He's just following the rules as established by his dad, the horn player. And some of his early works are nice, uninteresting, but nice. Then you get to the symphonic poems. Well, the symphonic poems, the chunk of those from the 1890s for the most part, are wonderful works with amazing, amazing passages and varying degrees of success in terms of their formal gambit. Probably the most successful of them all is Don Quixote, because it's a theme in variations. And so it's supposed to be sectional. Probably the least successful, in my view, is Ein Heldenleben, which really ought to end after the battle, but then goes on for 20 more minutes of folderol for no reason, other than there's an external program that he's imposing on the music. The key to understanding the form of Strauss's tone poems, as I point out in my book about Strauss, is find the development section, because they are all, in one way or another, extensions of sonata principles: exposition, development, recapitulation. But he managed to diddle that around. For example, in Don Juan, the development section it comes after a couple of episodes. It's that sort of party scene where all the themes get mixed up with each other. In Ein Heldenleben, it's the battle. In Zarathustra, basically, it's the fugue. The big fugue thing. It's a big fugal development section. Once you sort of isolate that, you could triangulate where you are in everything in the work. And then the only question is, when does it stop? And that is a problem that Strauss wrestled with. I mean, you can think about the Alpine Symphony. The development section is the storm. You've got one episode after another, all with their various themes, and then they all get agglomerated in the storm. Conglomerated, which is also the descent. It's a very fast descent. You're like sliding down on your ass is what's happening in the Alpine Symphony. And then once the descent has descended, the sun comes out and the night descends. Oh, it descends very slowly. It's it's endless. And Strauss had the same issue in his operas. It's really very interesting. I mean, the timing is you either have it or you don't. And however wonderful the music is, up to the point where you have your timing issue, it's still a timing issue. I mean, in most of Strauss operas, the plot ends, the story ends, and then they all start singing. There's the trio in Rosenkavalier, the big quartet at the end of Die Frau und Schatten, the endless epilogue of Ariadne auf Naxos. It just keeps going. Even Salome's final scene with the head, I mean, it's really cool because it's so gross and horrifying. And so that sort of gets you going. But musically speaking, I mean, she's singing to a head. I mean, how long does she have to sing to the head? I just think one of these days they ought to, just as a joke, sort of have the head look up at her and go, "Hi, how are you?" It should sing back. Something like that should happen. But, he really did have this issue with, like, drawing to a close. And he loved just spitting out endless melodic lines of soprano gorgeousness. I mean, and we don't regret it, because a lot of the best music happens in those unnecessary epilogues. So Strauss is definitely a guy who had formal issues. Charles Ives. Oh, Charles Ives. Charles Ives was fabulous because of what he did. In terms of mixing up things and being forward-thinking in terms of harmony and modern sounds and all of that stuff. He was never a form guy. really wasn't. I mean, his basic concept of form was ABA. I mean, that was sort of how Ives operated. And in most of his large works, his large orchestral works anyway, they all do the same thing. You begin with this sort of dissonant, drifty string thing, this fog of angular harmony, and then there's a middle section. And the middle section could be fast or slow or whatever, but there's a middle section with that's a potpourri of borrowed material and folk tunes, and it usually rises to some unbelievably screechy, dissonant wall of sound, which cuts off abruptly, and then you return to the beginning. That's how he handles like everything in the Holiday Symphony and in the Fourth Symphony, the parts that, not the fugue, of course, but the parts that are larger scale. That's the Ives thing. And, it worked. It worked for him. And the point is that you can't listen to a lot of these things at once in a row. Like when you do the Holiday Symphony as the whole thing, you wind up hearing like the same kind of form over and over again. And I think it risks monotony. But if you listen to these things individually, one at a time, and just take them in as unique creations, then all of a sudden the formal issue sort of goes away. But you cannot listen to Ives and care about form at all. However interesting everything else may be. Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff is the cut guy. Boy, is he the cut guy. I mean, the Second Symphony has cuts all over the place, right? They chopped out 20 minutes of the thing. What a pity. Actually, I think it's lovely the way he wrote it. I have no problem with the form of the whole work, but people did. People thought it was excessively lengthy and repetitious. And, wonderful performances happened of the cut version. And then there were the cuts in the Third Piano Concerto, for example. And his endless problems with the Second Piano Sonata. There's the first version, there's the second version, there's Horowitz's version. Everybody makes their own version. It's like a Heathkit piano sonata. You don't get a score, you get a selection of pages, and you get to put them together in whatever order works for you. So Rachmaninoff struggled with form. Actually, a lot of Russian composers did. It's very, very interesting. I think the reason they did is because their aesthetic and style were basically French, but their formal preoccupations with symphonic music and concertos were German. And that doesn't always go together terribly well. So Rachmaninoff had issues. Bruckner. Oh my God, did he have issues. Bruckner was fascinating because Bruckner actually was a revolutionary formal genius. He was, I think. He just didn't know it. He had no idea what he was really doing in terms of form. He thought he was following traditional sonata forms with maybe a third subject put in at the end of the exposition. That's what Bruckner thought he was doing. What he was really doing was creating this sort of modular system of block harmonic materials which would clash and alternate. And, the idea of Bruckner having like a development section is crazy. He just had no clue what that was. And as a result of that, and then as a result of the fact that the people around him particularly had no understanding of what he was doing, they had less understanding than he had. He at least knew how to write his music. They looked at this and just went, yeah. So they gave him constant nervous breakdowns, and he was incredibly insecure, and so he constantly revised everything. I mean, we know the story. It's a pity because sometimes those revisions were really good because they enhanced that sort of block-like modular quality. They made it even more clear and its outlines sharper, which was always a good thing. In his first versions, sometimes that eventual shape was very inchoate. That happened with the Third Symphony, for example. The second revision, the 1877 one, I think it was, is the one to go for. Then it all got destroyed later. The same thing with the Fourth. After that, he sort of gained his confidence and was fine until the first version of the Eighth, which Hermann Levy rejected, as we know, and caused Bruckner to revise everything he ever wrote. But the second version of the Eighth, for example, was infinitely superior to the first because its outlines are so much clearer. So Bruckner had formal issues. There's no question about it. But he was really doing something that was marvelous and has only, I think, recently come to be appreciated, blurred somewhat by the excessive zeal of the Bruckner scholarship, which wants to tell us that everything he did is as good as everything else, and that there are no preferred versions, and that everything should be heard equally because it's all equally wonderful and because it gives them a job. And that's a terrible thing to do to Bruckner. Raff, Joachim Raff. Now, Raff wrote, 11 symphonies? And lots and lots and lots and lots of other stuff. And he was, again, very, very popular in his day. Most of his symphonies are programmatic. They are complete formal non-entities for the most part. There is beautiful music in all of them. I mean, and he was a wonderful orchestrator. He helped Liszt with his orchestration and all of that. His most famous symphony is the Leonora Symphony, the fifth. But, Im Wald is wonderful, and To the Fatherland is wonderful. They're beautiful works. Lovely works. The problem with Spohr is that his idea of form was completely generic. I mean, his sonata movements are just sonata movements. He's going to have a first subject. He's going to have a second subject. They're going to get repeated. It's going to get, he is the king of unmotivated repetition in his works. And some cuts would actually kind of be nice. In some of those pieces, because they just get distended. They get distended by unnecessary repetition. And that's just Raff, not Spohr, pardon me. That's Raff. We did Spohr, and it's a shame because you play a lot of his music and there's wonderful material there, but how to deploy it to best effect was something that he wasn't that good at. I mean, that wasn't his thing, but nonetheless, he wrote some absolutely gorgeous material. His piano concerto and the Ode to Spring is this wonderful, wonderful music. Like a lot of romantic composers, he was probably at his best when he wasn't paying attention to traditional form, when he could do his own thing. We see lots of examples of that. And we'll get to that in a minute at the end of this talk, I think. After Raff, Scriabin. Some of you have jumped up and down when I talked about harmonists and left out Scriabin, and I probably should have included him because he was an amazing, amazing harmonist. But I also think Scriabin was something of a one-trick pony. There it is, the mystical chord. You know what I mean? And everything has to be based on that, and it all turns into sort of chromatic sludge at one point or another. I mean, those of you who idolize him will disagree with that description, obviously. But I do think that his range was really restricted. It was really pretty small. And when it came to form, I mean, he was just flabby. I mean, it really is. I mean, the Poem of Ecstasy is like one of those pieces where, you just wish that it would stop well before it does, because it's, oh God, here comes the trumpet again. Yeah, da 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 da. Whining trumpet. It's like, oh my God. Prometheus is just a giant blob of sound. I enjoy them. Don't get me wrong. I like them. But if you think about them formally, then you're going to be very unhappy. If you think about them coloristically and in lots of other ways, well, you can have a really good time. The symphonies, the first three symphonies, particularly the Divine Poem and those things, oh, wow, they're really very stiff formally. But they're full of shaggy, panting and heaving, wonderful melodic material. The piano sonatas are much better. They're concise and even shapely in places. Really kind of wonderful. I mean, his fifth sonata is one of my all-time favorite piano works, so I cannot complain. And the form is entirely what it is. It just goes the way it goes, and it's not terribly long, and it ends exactly when it's supposed to, and it's just terrific. So, like all of these people, they had their formaciously masterly moments. They did. Rimsky-Korsakov. Now, Rimsky-Korsakov, it's very interesting. He wrote 3 symphonies, remember, that he called symphonies. The second of which, Antar, he struggled with. He didn't want to call it a symphony eventually, because it's really kind of not, and it's wonderful. It's like a study for Scheherazade. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But it shows just how how difficult he found traditional form. He was self-taught. I understand that, But the First Symphony is basically student work. The Third Symphony is okay in places. It's attractive, but it just doesn't have the glitter and the fun of his later technically non-symphonic works. Antar is like the test case because it doesn't really have a movement in sonata form, which most symphonies really ought to have somewhere, at least if they're traditional symphonies. And he thought he was writing traditional symphonies. The second movement is just a mess at wannabe fugal writing. It's supposed to represent anger. And it's like do 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 ba ba da 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 wheep da 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 wheep. It's kind of actually risible in places, but the finale, which is an adagio, it's a slow movement, is beautiful, absolutely lovely. So you can see how much happier he was when he could be a colorist, when he could simply alternate themes. And Scheherazade, of course, is one of the most repetitious pieces in the universe. It's sustained by its orchestration. And Rimsky-Korsakov said that. That was his point. That's what he was trying to do, to create a symphonic work that existed on repetition of like wonderful sounding motives that he could score fabulously. And that would keep up your interest. And it does. But, the symphonic thing, no. And he was also another one of those composers who never knew when to quit. He tends to like to write long, drawn-out, quiet endings that just keep on going. The Scheherazade's a case in point. An absolute case in point. Fortunately, in the Capriccio Espagnol and the Russian Easter Overture, they end with a bang, and a really good bang at that. So Rimsky had his issues. And in his operas, too, you find the same thing. You have these sort of distended episodes in between all the juicy, folksy stuff that we love to listen to. And last but not least, Schumann. Oh boy. Schumann was the king of the non-developing development section. He never had a clue what to do in a development section. The locus classicus of that is the first movement of the Renner Symphony, where you just hear him wondering, how do I get out of this mess? It goes do 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 do. Oh my God, what do I do next? Bop boo, bop boo. Oh no, that doesn't work. How about the second subject? Yeah, but then how do I get back to the first subject? Oh my God. Finally, he has a horn call. Da ba da da. It's the happiest horn call in the universe. You can just feel his relief when it finally shows up, and he knows he can get back. What the heck was that? And he knows, thank you. This is the she's doing this now. She's waiting till I get into the middle of something, and then she stomps all over the computer. Why do you do that, Finster? Huh? Why? Why? Yes, why? I don't know. Okay. Anyway, so Schumann is absolutely at his best when he is creating his own forms, such as the fantasy in C, his suite pieces, Carnival, the Davidsbündler-Tänze, Kreisleriana. He was fabulous at putting together wonderful nuggets of romantic lyrical poetry, as long as he didn't have to enlarge them into traditional forms. And this is an issue with all of his larger things, his string quartets, his sonatas. I mean, they all have issues with his big sonata form movements. He's beautiful at slow movements. His scherzos are fun. His finales go rather nicely, except to the Renish again, where it's a total non-moving finale. The Fourth Symphony, which he originally called like Symphonic Fantasia, is another wonderful piece where the form generates itself and all the movements are interconnected. You get this feeling that he's really happier when he could do his own thing. And that's true of a lot of composers. But what's interesting is that in the Romantic era, it was the first period in our musical tradition where composers had to take account of the past. You know, music wasn't just modern music. I mean, Mendelssohn was sort of responsible for that. You know, his historical concerts for bringing back Bach and Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn, and you know, there was the classical canon was being formed, and so composers were being compared to that, and they felt they had to do that, but their style was different, and their inclinations were different, their aesthetic was different. And so it's not surprising that when it came to writing in traditional forms, they were somewhat creaky. But when they had the opportunity to do their own thing, to simply create their own concept of what the form would be, if it was well suited to the material they chose, they did miraculous and revolutionary things. They just weren't successful at it all the time. So that's my list. If you've got some formally creaky composers that you want to talk about, feel free to chime in. It's a fun topic. It really is. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.